So yes, our topic for the evening is ancient Israel, what remains. And just by way of a brief recap around the premise of this topic, and I think most people were here last time, so I'll try and rush through this, but just in case anyone wasn't here, we're talking specifically in these two sessions about the northern kingdom of Israel. That's the particular focus we're making. And this is an area of history and archaeology that is, compared to the southern kingdom of Judah, a bit understudied. It's not as well known and not as much research has been done, so it can be a very interesting topic to explore. So yeah, the northern kingdom there, greater in territorial extent, centered on Samaria, but of course, importantly, did not include the city of Jerusalem. And here's a bit of a timeline of the period we're looking at. So we're looking at that yellow band there, and I've also included King Solomon as well in this because he also ruled that northern area. And that is the kings of Israel there. You can see that it ends with the Assyrian captivity in 709 or 711, depending on which dating you use. And in the south there, the southern kingdom of Judah continued on for much longer. In fact, it continued on for another good sort of 150 years-ish. And that's part of the reason that we have a lot more evidence for things in the south, because the kingdom just lasted for so much longer and into a more recent, historically speaking, time period. The other big difference, which you can spot pretty quickly between Israel and Judah, is that in the south there was just one dynasty, the Davidic dynasty, that started with David and all of his descendants through to the very end, with Jehoiachin being the final king before the captivity. Whereas in the north we have several, well, not even dynasties, but just several successive overthrows of the kingdom. The only two dynasties that were actually established in the northern kingdom were the Omride dynasty, there in red, and the Jehu dynasty there in blue. And those were actually periods of reasonable prosperity in the northern kingdom. Those two dynasties certainly made the biggest impact, archaeologically speaking, and we'll definitely hear a bit more about them tonight. And in terms of looking at this topic from, I guess, a spiritual perspective, a Bible class perspective, the value of this is that the Northern Kingdom presents a pretty interesting and powerful case study of what happens when God's people stop caring about God. In contrast to the Southern Kingdom, the Northern Kingdom was constantly apostate. Though at times it worshipped Yahweh in a form, it was only ever a corrupt and idolatrous form. And yeah, as a result, their culture eroded very quickly. And we'll see evidence of that tonight in a variety of different forms. Whereas in the Southern Kingdom, there was at least some spiritual continuity there. And that actually led to a more stable rulership. So some spiritual lessons to be gained from that as well. So we'll get into it. Tonight we're going to have more of a cultural focus. So last time we looked at kind of the nuts and bolts of the kingdom. We looked at sort of its economic basis, the fact that it was very agricultural. We looked at some of the technologies and tools and occupations that existed. We looked at the social hierarchy of the kingdom. This time we're going to look at more cultural things. We're going to look at religion, and we're going to look at art, architecture, writing, and leisure. So we'll start off by talking about conflicting religions. And it certainly was the case that Israel was a place of great conflict in terms of religion. We know that they were coming from a backdrop of extremely strong monotheism. These, after all, were the Israelites that were brought out of Egypt and had been given the law of Moses, which commanded that they would have no other gods, no idols, and it was very unusual. This is a very strange religion in the context of the Near East, which was very polytheistic, very idolatrous, and lots of what we call syncretism. We'll talk a little bit more about that concept tonight, but lots of trading and connecting between different pantheons of gods, equivalent gods in different pantheons and things like that. Israel, in its origins, was commanded to have none of this. This would, of course, lead to a lot of tensions. So let's have a look at some of what happened in that regard. Well, and another thing I should mention about the approach we're doing tonight is we're going on a bit of you could call it a museum tour of different sources. That's where a lot of what I'm going to be presenting tonight comes from, is little snippets of information, whether that is from the biblical text, which is a valuable historical text, or archaeological artifacts or sites that reveal things about the kingdom, the things that remain. So start off with this cultic altar at Dan, at the very top of the kingdom of Israel. Now, what you see photographed there, that metal structure is not ancient. That is a modern reconstruction, and it's a very clever outline to show you the rough size of the altar that would have been built there. And it's a horned altar, which was a very popular design in the Near East. It actually enabled you to sort of tie down the sacrifice to those four corners there. And yes, it's very iconic design. Now, the altar, the foundations there date from the time of Jeroboam II. Very powerful king, very prosperous king, and very little, interestingly, is recorded about his reign in the Bible. And it is built on the site of the high place established by Jeroboam I, who was much earlier, no relation, just the same name. And he was the first king of the northern kingdom after the split between Jeroboam and Rehoboam after Solomon. And the biblical record claims that this involved the worship of a golden calf, and it was in direct opposition to the Yahwism of Jerusalem. Just in case anyone wasn't here last time, I will occasionally use that term Yahwism. That's because we're looking here at Israel from a historical perspective rather than simply just a spiritual perspective. And yeah, while that term can be a bit confronting, it's used by historians basically as a somewhat sad acknowledgement that in Israel there was more than one God, unfortunately. They weren't meant to have more than one God, but they did. And so Yahwism refers specifically to the worship of Yahweh. And it can come in different forms as well, as we'll see. But yes, this is some interesting evidence for that high place that Jeroboam set up. We'll talk more about that actually, so I won't go into too much more detail right yet. But that's an evidence for some conflicting religion there. Now this is a very interesting artifact. This is a cult stand from a place called Tanakh in northern Israel, and it dates from the time of Solomon, if not slightly earlier. And it seems to depict Asherah. And really what we've got here, so it's a cult stand. You would sort of pour liquid offerings into the top of it there. And each sort of tier of this cult stand is meant to represent a different deity, they believe. So it seems to depict Asherah. And it also perhaps alludes to Yahweh in some form. The sort of second tier from the bottom, you can see there's kind of two weird sort of vaguely anthropoid sort of human-shaped figures there flanking a gap in the middle. There are theories that might be meant to represent Yahweh, which would be interesting, right? They've avoided physically representing this god because, you know, according to the law, they weren't meant to do that. But of course, in the process of doing this, they're also worshipping Asherah. They're also creating images of other things. So of course, this is corrupt. This is not permissible under the law of Moses. So perhaps what we have here is a polytheistic form of Yahwism, which is, you know, pretty disturbing for us to see something like this. It's sort of, you know, it's bad enough to think of people rejecting God and worshipping other deities. but to think about them kind of mingling the one true God with the false gods is quite confronting, right? So this is an interesting source of evidence for the kind of religious practices that were going on in the Northern Kingdom. And here's a scriptural reference, which is a useful source for, I guess, the way that it could swing in either direction. So this is about the purge of Jehu, when he tricked the prophets of Baal into meeting all in one place and then wiped them out according to the command of God. It says in 2 Kings 10, the royal garden officers struck the prophets of Baal down with the sword and left their bodies lying there. They demolished the sacred pillar of Baal and the temple of Baal. It is used as a latrine to this very day. So Jehu eradicated Baal worship from Israel. So we can see, Jehu taking some pretty strong measures here to wipe out Baal worship, and it's a clear sign of the level of conflict that occurred at times in religion. I mentioned earlier, and actually, sorry, even before I jump to that slide, it should be noted that unfortunately Jehu still worshipped the Jeroboam's idols at Dan and Bethel, the golden calves. So although he did wipe out Baal worship, he still did worship the golden calves, which is a pretty remarkably historically forgetful way to worship the gods that brought you out of Egypt, when there would have been a cultural memory of the golden calf that Aaron constructed alongside the Israelites, or that the Israelites constructed under Aaron's supervision. So yes, Jehu did not wholeheartedly serve Yahweh. And yes, I'll talk more about what Jeroboam was doing there in a minute. But yeah, I talked about this idea of syncretism. So this is where you take the gods of another culture and you incorporate them in your own religion, and you sort of say, oh, well, that's the equivalent of this. This happened a lot between the Greeks and Romans, for instance. So the Greek god Zeus was syncretized with the Roman god Jupiter. They're sort of equivalent deities, and they sort of took on each other's attributes. And there's lots of other examples in those pantheons as well. An interesting thing goes on in terms of the worship of Baal. There's what you could call representational syncretism, in that the way that the gods were portrayed had a connection. It was visually similar. So we're going to start somewhere unexpected, in Egypt, not in land of Israel or anywhere around. So this is what's called the Nama palette. This is a very ancient artifact, very important artifact for, I think, not even Old Kingdom Egypt. I think it's pre-dynastic Egypt. So we've got there a depiction of the pharaoh or the king smiting his enemies. Very popular Egyptian pose there, holding the battle mace above his head, about to club one of his enemies to death. That's a pretty typical Egyptian design. Now get this. Here is a statue of Baal. Looks kind of similar, doesn't it? He's even wearing what appears to be I believe it's the crown of the lower Nile. I always get the crowns mixed up with Egypt, but one of the two. And it's eerily similar, isn't it? Even, over 1,500 years later, it's exactly the same pose and very similar headgear going on there. So this is a statue of Baal. Now, it does predate our time period a little bit, but this is a very sort of famous statue of Baal, and there have been other ones found from later, but they're sort of in pieces, and this is kind of the most intact version that always gets pointed to. And Baal is a god of thunder, by the way. He's a weather god. So in his upraised hand there, it's likely that he was holding some kind of thunderbolt. That's what it's believed to have been. This then passes on through culture around the Mediterranean into this kind of statue from Greece. We've got a Greek hunter statue here in a very similar pose, and the same sort of thing goes on slightly later with this statue of Zeus, of Artemision. And of course, this has an interesting connection to Baal because Zeus is also a god of thunder, and he would very much have been holding a thunderbolt in that upraised hand there. So you can see how all of these Mediterranean cultures had connections in terms of their iconography, in terms of their deities, and Israel would have fallen into this as well. When Israel was called by God to be a separate and a peculiar people, that was a big deal in terms of culture in the Mediterranean, because so much was passed around, so much was shared. For them to stand out and not only not create this kind of God, but not to have any idols at all, was a pretty extreme thing. And sadly, for the Northern Kingdom, it was too much, and they fell into this kind of thing. We'll talk about a different aspect of religion now. We'll talk about the role of prophets. So for starters, prophets had an important position in society. We've got a description here from 2 Kings 9. It says that the prophet poured the olive oil on Jehu's head and said to him, "This is what Yahweh, God of Israel, has said. I have designated you as king over Yahweh's people, Israel." So we can see here that a prophet has, pretty significant power if he's able to make this kind of proclamation, just in I guess a historical sense, without even considering the spiritual dimension of the fact that, God has literally appointed Jehu as king here. So yeah, prophets, and it's this sort of funny thing about prophets. It's that whole thing of proximity to power, right? It's dangerous. They had the ability to make huge decisions, but they could also very quickly be turned upon by royalty. And we see this at various times and in various kingdoms throughout Scripture, that being a prophet was a big responsibility and could be quite dangerous if the king chose to turn on you. Elijah is a good example of how the prophet had a responsibility to hold people accountable to their spiritual commitments and decisions. Prophets had to make public declarations about religious matters. So Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." So he's calling out that same conflicting religious aspect that we were looking at in the previous slide there, the fact that these people needed to choose a side. I've got an interesting description from the same chapter, actually just a couple of verses earlier, about the structure of religion in Israel. So Elijah's talking to Ahab here, and Ahab refers to Elijah as the troubler of Israel. You're causing all this trouble. But Elijah replies to him and says, "I've not brought disaster on Israel. You and your father's dynasty have, by abandoning Yahweh's commandments and following the Baals. Assemble all Israel before me at Mount Carmel, as well as the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, whom Jezebel supports." So we can see that these religions there's a couple of things going on here. Number one, they're pretty popular to have that many prophets, like that many, organized religious personnel involved. They are organized, and they're divided as well. There's a bit of nuance to it, so it's not just you're a prophet of all the gods. There were specific prophets for Baal, and there were specific prophets for Asherah, and Jezebel was instrumental in providing support for them as well. So there was there was royal, what should we say? There was royal support and condoning of these practices. Miller and Hayes, I alluded to them last time. They're sort of modern historians writing about ancient Israel. Have an interesting comment to make about the role of prophets like Elijah. They say that political activism on the part of the Yahwistic prophets must be mentioned among the contributing factors to instability in the north, which of course makes sense, right? that prophet in the top left source there, who anointed Jehu, has anointed him to have the job of overthrowing the Omride dynasty, of wiping out, I think, is it Jehoram, last of the line of Ahab, and just wiping out that dynasty entirely. So that is contributing to instability. There's not just one dynasty as a result of this kind of thing. The prophets of Yahweh had, of course, loyalty to Jerusalem and to the temple in Jerusalem. And they were constantly bringing up the fact, the awkward and, much preferred to be ignored fact, that Israel did not have that connection back to the holy city and to the city of David and to the temple of Solomon. They were constantly bringing this up, and it created instability. It undermined the legitimacy of these northern kings, because they didn't have that cultural backing the southern kings did. So prophets were pretty significant in that way. Let's have a look at a slightly more extended example. And I'm aware that last time I just kind of spoke to my slides and lectured you the whole time. Let's make this a little bit more interactive. So if you could open up your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4. And I'll get Dad to read 2 Kings 4 verses 8 to 13.
2 Kings chapter 4, beginning at verse 8. And it fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where there was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was that as oft as he passed by, he turned in thither to eat bread. And she said unto her husband, Behold now, I perceive that this is an holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall. Let us set for him there a bed and a table and a stool and a candlestick, and it shall be, when he cometh to us, that he shall turn in thither. And it fell on a day that he came thither, and he turned into the chamber and lay there. And he said to Gehazi his servant, Call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said unto him, Say now unto her, Behold, thou hast been careful for us with all this care. What is to be done for thee? Wouldst thou be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the host? And she answered, I dwell among mine own people.
All right, thank you very much. So I'll put the question to you, and there's a couple of different things you can pull out of this. Viewing those verses through, I guess, kind of a historical lens rather than a spiritual lens, what kind of insights do those verses give us into the culture of Israel, the role of prophets, those kind of things? There's a couple of little things kind of hidden away there. If you focus on them, you realize some things about prophets and about Israelite culture.
Clearly, they had great respect for the prophet. For a start, and it's interesting that being a woman, she seemed to be, in a way, sort of more important than a husband.
Yeah, so definitely they had great respect for this man of God, so they wanted to help the prophet. So that the prophets were not without support in the Northern Kingdom. And yes, she has a surprising level of agency here, this woman. We spoke about this last time when we were talking about the role of women in Israelite society, that because the biblical record and archaeological artifacts tend to focus on the big scale stuff, we don't hear so much about women because they didn't play those leading roles in politics and in culture. And in the military, unless it was sort of royal women like Jezebel or Bathsheba. But then the biblical record kind of zooms in on these people that Elijah and Elisha interacted with, and we get an insight here into this woman who has quite a bit of agency. It says that she was a wealthy woman, and wealth does tend to increase your agency in the ancient world, but she had the ability to make these kind of decisions and to encourage her husband to facilitate this kind of thing. Good. Is there anything else we can spot in those verses about culture or about prophets?
Sorry, Matt, just to add to what your dad said before, especially in 2 Kings 8, when she goes away, they go into the land of Philistines for 7 years and comes back. It says that she asked the king for her house and her land. Like, you know what I mean? It's that again emphasizes, that she as a woman was either respected or able to do those sorts of things and appeal to the king.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, I hadn't noticed that one, so I'll make a note of that for next time I teach the course. Yeah, that's
so 2 Kings 8 verse 3.
Yeah, thanks for that. Terrific. There's one more thing I can note there. Notice Elisha's question to her at the end. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? What does that imply about prophets?
It means they had a bit of influence to the king.
Yeah, so they had access to these people, and this is the kind of leverage that they might be able to apply on behalf of someone who wanted them to. So yeah, this is when you read passages like this. Of course, there's powerful spiritual lessons to be learned about generosity, about the way that we can support people in their spiritual work and ministry. But there's also little sort of cultural insights in there as well, because this is a historical text, the Bible. This is full of ancient insights. So that's an interesting way to look at it. One last aspect of religion I want to talk about is the role of priests and the Jerusalem temple in opposition to the Northern Kingdom. This was sort of an interesting concession made in the ancient history syllabus to the Southern Kingdom, was that they did at least let us look at the way that the Southern Kingdom opposed the Northern Kingdom. So here's a bit of a longer source, but a pretty telling one. The incident of Jehoiada, who was high priest, and his opposition to Athaliah. Now, I'll sort of read this box in reverse, but Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab, the king of Israel, and she'd become queen of Judah by marrying into the Davidic dynasty. So this is an interesting instance in which a northern princess and then queen has had a big influence on the politics of the Southern Kingdom. We know that she arranged to have the entire royal family executed. She was pretty psychopathic, as the biblical record presents her. And Jehoiada, the high priest in Jerusalem, played an instrumental role in opposing her when the right time came. So Jehoiada, the high priest, brought out the captains who were set over the army, saying to them, "Bring Athaliah out between the ranks, and anyone who follows her is to be put to death. Do not put her to death in the house of Yahweh." So they laid hands on her, and they went into the entrance of the horse gate of the king's house, and they put her to death there. So this is an interesting passage because, like prophets, it seems like the high priest also has quite a lot of political leverage. He's able to organize the army. He's able to bring out the captains, set them out in ranks, and he's able to give instructions to have the queen executed. He's actually, I guess in historical terms, leading what would be called a military coup here. And we know that this was in order to put the true descendant of David on the throne. My mind's gone blank. Someone remind me. Who was the little king that he was supporting here?
Joash, yeah.
Joash. Thanks for that. Terrific. So yes, Jehoiada here supporting Joash, descendant of David, to carry on the Davidic dynasty. So a pretty significant action here on behalf of the priests in Jerusalem temple. A little earlier in the record, this is in the early days of the separation between the kingdoms, when there was a lot of border conflict. there's a very interesting moment when Abijah, king of Judah, confronts the army of Jeroboam I, king of Israel, on the battlefield. This is what he calls out across the battlefield. He says, "Behold, God is with us at our head, and his priests with their battle trumpets to sound the call to battle against you. O sons of Israel, do not fight against Yahweh, the God of your fathers, for you cannot succeed." So this is, pretty big words, and it's a clear demonstration of the fact that the kings of Judah saw themselves as legitimate for the fact that they had the priests of God, the priests of Yahweh. They had their battle trumpets there, and they were supported by the true God. This would have, really got under the skin of the northern kingdom. And this is made clear from another reference, which I'll put up now. When the split first occurred, Jeroboam said in his heart, "Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of Yahweh at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me." So Jeroboam straight away recognized that this was a threat. The fact that he didn't have the connection to Jerusalem and to the temple, and this was the place where God had put his name, and the place that was appointed under the law for sacrifices. He knew that this totally destabilized his whole legitimacy, and that's why he set up those altars and those golden calves at Dan and Bethel to try and give himself a sense of legitimacy. And the record says that he said, "These are the gods," plural, "that brought you out of Egypt." Now, I'm not sure, it is the word Elohim, which often we just apply to the singular God. So I'm not sure exactly why translators choose to pluralize it there, because it's entirely possible that Jeroboam was claiming that these gods, these golden calves rather, represented Yahweh, and that he was trying to wrest attention away from the temple. At least that makes sense to me as to what he would have been trying to do, is try to say, well, actually, no, Yahweh's on my side and you can worship him here. And this really demonstrates how important the priests in the Jerusalem temple were in terms of the cultural consciousness of the Israelites, north and south. Just as a little tidbit to sprinkle in there, because it's interesting. There is a little piece of evidence here for the Jerusalem temple. Now, we've got very, very limited evidence for the first temple, the temple of Solomon. But this is one piece that does get pointed to quite regularly. This is an ostracon. That means it's a pottery fragment. And back in ancient times, in the times of the northern and southern kingdoms, you would only ever write something on parchment if it was, or papyrus, if it was quite important, like a legal document or something that was really meant to, be recorded in a significant way. For everything else, including sending letters, they would use fragments of pottery. This is what you would sort of, scribble your notes and things on. Even receipts were recorded on fragments of pottery. And this one is a letter that includes the phrase, "the house of Yahweh," which may well be a reference to the Jerusalem temple. It says something about, with regard to your servant, fear not, for he is in the house of Yahweh. So some take this as evidence for the existence of the Jerusalem temple. And by the way, I should affirm that this is not to state that I in any way doubt the existence of Solomon's temple. This is just a piece of archaeological evidence that may point to its existence. We'll move on now to talk about art and architecture and those kind of cultural things. So last time we had a question about, the scale of Samaria. So let's talk about Samaria. It was established as the capital of the northern kingdom by Omri. It wasn't initially the capital. The capital was Tirzah at first, at the time of the split. But then Omri purchased the hill of Samaria and established his capital there. And it was a very well fortified city. It was surrounded by a casemate wall. That's kind of a double wall that could be filled with earth and stone in the event of a siege, which is a pretty nifty strategy. So, and this would have been similar to what was going on in Jericho as well, where you had Rahab's house in the wall. There were sort of double walls here that had sort of buildings and rooms in between them, and yeah, they could be filled up in the event of siege to really bolster the construction. And Samaria boasted a palatial complex, a palace complex that was considered one of the largest Iron Age structures in the Levant. Once it's been, all the footprint of that has all been excavated, and it's pretty huge. Was described by one particular professor of archaeology as a Bit Halani, or a house of windows, which follows some Assyrian influences. It seems to be modeled on Assyrian palaces. So this was a pretty significant structure. Megiddo was another of the fortified cities, and here's a sign of how well prepared it was for a siege. And then last time we talked about the water tunnel at Megiddo, pretty impressive, very useful in time of siege. Here's another thing. This is a grain silo that was from the time of Jeroboam II, had a capacity of 450 cubic meters, and they've actually found straw between the stones, and that attests to its function. This was a grain silo, and it was a vital supply in the event of a siege. You wouldn't just keep your usual big pots of grain. You would actually have a big grain silo dug into the ground to make sure you were able to outlast your enemy in those times. And one last piece of evidence regarding architecture in fortified cities is the Israelite Gate of Megiddo, which is actually that picture that I've been featuring on the slides. And this was a 6-chambered gate. I should have put some kind of diagram into my slides of this, but it's kind of almost like a series of teeth, a corridor with 6 little chambers off to the side. And this was a common defensive feature of Israelite fortified cities of the period. Often it was combined with a right-angled entryway, so that basically if an army was approaching and trying to breach the city walls, and in these times, it wasn't really common to have, as you sort of see in the movies, big wooden doors on hinges that were sort of braced, and people would try to knock those down. Instead, you would just have a long approach up to the city, but then turned a right angle and passed through these 6 chambers, which basically made an approaching enemy very vulnerable. They would have to, of course, maneuver around that 90-degree turn, which was an awkward thing to have to do in a charge. And then passing through the 6 gates, they would be vulnerable to missile fire from either side and from overhead. So it was a good fortification design. And it also accommodated political and legal functions. We read about people like Lot and people like Mordecai sitting in the gate. That would be in one of these little chambers, and that was a place where big legal and political decisions were made. Ahab, when he was deciding whether or not to go to war against the Syrians, he also met with his prophets in the gate. That's where they would make those decisions. It was a very prominent location in the city. And there is some scholarly debate over whether this gate should be attributed to Solomon or later kings of the Omride or even Jehu dynasties. It's hard to tell exactly how much can be attributed to Solomon that still remains, or whether it's just buried deeper underneath all of this stuff in the Tell. We know that ancient peoples tended to layer things on top and to reuse materials. But yes, there's not exactly sure when this gate was constructed in Megiddo, but it was an Israelite gate. Here's another fortified city. This is one at Jezreel. And as we were talking about last time, kind of the design of these fortified cities was that it would be up on a high vantage point where you could easily see the whole surrounding area, including any approaching armies. And then the Israelites also had chariot garrisons up on top of these fortified cities, and they could charge them down the hill into those plains and rout approaching enemy armies. So yeah, there's a nice picture of Jezreel, and it's quite a nice place, isn't it? The Northern Kingdom has lots of these sort of lovely green pastures. You don't tend to think of Israel in that way, but in the north, it's actually quite fertile. Let's talk about art. Now, when it comes to Israelite art, you've got to keep in mind that there was a lot of destruction of iconography throughout history. And that was for cultural reasons, different cultures trying to assert themselves and replace the existing cultures, for political reasons, when different kings would overtake each other and try and wipe out each other's cultural achievements, for religious reasons. And we know, of course, that the Israelites were commanded to destroy images. And although that wasn't, necessarily very consistently kept in the Northern Kingdom, there would have been time periods of reform and destruction, like with Jehu and the destruction of Baal. So there are various reasons why not a lot of art has been preserved in the Northern Kingdom. And then, as we mentioned last time, just all the many layers of settlement from all the succeeding occupying empires. But here's a couple of examples. So this is one of what is called the Sumerian ivories. And in fact, it was over 12,000 pieces of Sumerian ivory excavated. Not all of them as nice and intact as this. This is a prime example, one of the best. Lots of other just little bits and fragments and things. But this supports the biblical record's claim that Ahab had an ivory house. It talks about Ahab having an ivory house at Samaria, which likely refers to a palace room decorated with ivory. This kind of thing would have adorned all of the walls of that room. And it seems to follow a Phoenician appropriation of Egyptian design, which makes a lot of sense. So the Phoenicians were to the north in present-day Lebanon, and they were the great maritime traders all around the Mediterranean. And it says in 1 Kings that Solomon had at sea a navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram of Phoenicia, bringing gold and silver and ivory. So we know that the Israelites were trading for ivory with the Phoenicians. And this design that we've got on the screen there is very, according to experts, fits into kind of the Phoenician version of Egyptian designs. I mean, you can see the face of that figure. It's kind of a sphinx. Looks very Egyptian, doesn't it? To me, the whole thing looks kind of Assyrian, kind of like those winged lions and winged bulls of Assyria. So you can see there's lots of cultural influences going on here. Here's another piece of art from, or rather just an artistic artifact from Israel that shows some cultural influences. So this is a seal, a royal seal, of a man named Abdi. So the inscription there says that it's the seal of a royal minister of King Hoshea, who was the last king of Israel before the Assyrian captivity. And the design clearly displays some Egyptian influences. You can see that man in his posture and the little winged sun disk down below is very Egyptian. But you've got that Paleo-Hebrew script around the edges. That's not, hieroglyphs or anything Egyptian. And this accords well with what we read in 2 Kings. It says that the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was planning a revolt. Hoshea had sent messages to King So of Egypt and had not sent his annual tribute. So we can see that Hoshea did have an alliance with Egypt, and there was probably some cultural influence going on there. And what these two artifacts demonstrate is that Israel did not have a very distinctive visual culture of its own. It appropriated elements of visual culture from the surrounding nations, which makes sense, right? They weren't meant to have their own visual culture. What's going on here is that they are being influenced by the idolatry and by the culture of the surrounding nations. Here's another example of a royal seal. And by the way, these are all just, simply great evidence for the fact that the kingdom of northern Israel is a legitimate historical thing. These kings that are mentioned in the Bible aren't just made up. We actually have seals that have their names on them. So this is another example. It was only finally authenticated in 2020, and it's actually, interestingly enough, this is what's called a bulla, which is the seal impression. It's not the seal itself. There was a seal found in the early 20th century that had exactly the same design as this, but it was lost, which is like pretty shocking, right? And this sort of stuff sadly happens a lot in, late 19th, early 20th century history, with all of the handover and all of the war and all of the politics of the Middle East. Things like a seal of Jeroboam were actually found and then lost around 1910 in this instance, which is pretty sad. Hopefully one day it shows up. But yes, this article from 2020 says the remarkable lost seal and the newly authenticated seal impression are adorned by a roaring lion that stands with its tail raised, over which there's a Paleo-Hebrew inscription which says belonging to Shema, the servant or minister of Jeroboam. So this is referring to Jeroboam II. So we've got, again, a small sort of artwork, I guess, here of a lion, and we know that the lion is a powerful symbol of Israel. We would normally associate it with Judah, but here it is being used in the north. The final category I want to talk to you about tonight is writing and leisure. What evidence do we have for these things? Well, we have to keep in mind that the biblical record comes from Judah, essentially. A lot of it would have come out of the prophets and the priests and the kings of Judah, centered on Jerusalem. So the biblical record itself doesn't necessarily illuminate much about the Northern Kingdom's writing and literature. This is what I kind of had to restrict myself to with the HSE course. But let's have a look at what we can glean. So we've got the descriptions of the Northern Kingdoms from the Southern perspective. For instance, 2 Kings 13 verse 2 says that Jehoahaz did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. He did not depart from them. Now, this is a very formulaic assessment of this reign. We read about this many times in the records of the kings. Followed all the ways of his father Jeroboam that made Israel to sin. That comes up again and again and again. It's a formula. It's a specific way of writing to describe a specific scenario that will be familiar to the readers. And it's typical of the Yahwist perspective of the biblical record. It's not just there to record history, it's also there to give a spiritual judgment from the perspective of Yahweh of how the kings reigned. So we've got an interesting example there. The Bible is full of these kind of formulas. There's lots of formulaic expressions, and that's one example. Proverbs was from the time of Solomon, so these kind of sayings would have circulated in the Northern Kingdom as well. And this particular example has an agricultural focus. It makes sense that a kingdom that was based on agriculture would have sayings based in agriculture. So Proverbs 14 verse 4 says, where there are no oxen, the feeding trough is clean, but an abundant harvest is produced by strong oxen. It's a bit of a weird proverb, right? It's a bit obscure to us. What does that mean? It's not very relatable. But essentially what it means, when you take the culture into perspective, is that you sort of have to spend money to make money, as it were. A farmer has to have strong oxen to plow the fields, and to get strong oxen, you have to feed them. So you have to sacrifice a little bit of your agricultural output to strengthen your oxen so that you can plow better and get a better yield in the long run, is kind of what this proverb is saying. And historians would consider this to be an example of ancient wisdom literature. There's a whole sort of genre of this sort of thing in the Near East. And as I said, it reflects those agricultural concerns and priorities of ancient Israel. In terms of actual writing that did actually happen in the Northern Kingdom, one prominent example is what's called the Samaria ostraca. So again, these are pottery sherds This is what you did your daily writing on, not your important legal writing or your literary writing, but your day-to-day business was done with these fragments of pottery. And these were used to record receipts of deliveries of wine and oil to the king. We don't actually know which king. It's suspected it was either Ahab or Jeroboam II, but these record those deliveries of agricultural produce to the king. Interestingly, we've got they've studied these and they've done all kinds of research on them in recent years, including using sort of machine learning and AI to try and analyze the handwriting. And basically, what they've come up with is that there's very few scribes. Most of these ostraca, although they record receipts of goods from all over the kingdom, were all written by the same handful of people. What this tends to suggest was that there was what's called a centralized palace bureaucracy. There was a small group of highly trained people who could write these things down. And this tends to suggest that this was a well-organized system. Samaria was the center of the kingdom, and that literacy was still a relatively rare thing in Israel. You still had to have highly trained scribes to be able to record these kinds of things. And in terms of leisure, we have an interesting little example here from Hatzor in northern Israel. This is a game board. This dates from the period of the Northern Kingdom. This is one of the games that they would have played in Bible times in the land of Israel. And we're not exactly sure which game this is. It resembles a couple of games. It's similar to Senet from Egypt and Tau from Mesopotamia. They're both sort of race games. The royal game of is another example that gets spoken about a lot. There's some really entertaining videos of people playing that online. And basically, these are the ancient ancestors of backgammon, kind of a race game where you're trying to get all your counters off the board before the other person. So that's a little interesting insight into kind of leisure activities in Israel. I'll also talk just briefly about the fact that the biblical record in terms of writing is written using specific ancient language devices. So we've got on the top left there a very formulaic assessment of Jehoahaz's reign. Other Hebrew formulas that come up are things called parallelisms. I haven't got an example of this, and it's probably a good thing I haven't because we're running out of time, but you see this all the way through the Psalms. Basically pick up any psalm in the book of Psalms, and you will find a verse where it basically says the same thing twice in two different ways. This is a very common Hebrew writing construction. It's even used, pardon me, to just in individual words to emphasize things. So, for instance, in Genesis, where it says, dying you shall die, literally, that's just a Hebrew way of emphasizing something. It's like, you're gonna die, and some versions will say, you shall surely die. That is how ancient Hebrew is written, and yeah, that can happen in terms of whole phrases as well. I really should have given you an example, but you would not have to look hard at all to find one. I literally gave my students a challenge to see how many they could find in a space of time, and they came up with tons of them. So yeah, parallelisms are another interesting Hebrew writing construction. And one last one to finish with is the idea of chiasmus. So a chiasm is where you have words and phrases that mirror in terms of a written structure at the beginning and the end, and they sort of focus in on a central idea. There's loads of this going on in the whole Bible, particularly in Psalms and other sort of poetic kind of books. But all through Scripture we get this this writing form, which clearly was very popular with ancient Hebrew. So here's an example in Psalm 51. You might actually just turn up Psalm 51, and I'll bring things up onto the screen as I'm reading it to bring out this particular pattern. So Psalm 51, and I'll read through there. So this is a Psalm of David. It says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities." So if you look on the screen there, you can see how the ideas in this part of the psalm are mirrored. We've got blot out as the A section there, and then moving inwards, we've got wash and clean, then sin, and this centers on the central idea D, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. And this makes sense, right? Because the purpose of a psalm, at least especially for a recorded psalm, is to give praise to God. It's to glorify and uphold God's righteousness. And that's what this psalm does, is its central idea there at D. It's, of course, also praying for forgiveness and acknowledging sin. And it's a beautiful example of repentance. But that central idea of glorifying God is brought out by this chiasmus here. There's actually an interesting website you might like to look up called Chiasmus Exchange. I think it's run by the Rugby Ecclesia in the UK, and they've just literally dedicated the website to finding examples of chiasms in the Bible, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them. Some of them are a bit more spurious than others, but this one on the screen is a nice strong one that shows how these sort of structures were used by the ancient Hebrews. So let's wrap up. So as we said last time, culturally speaking, Israel was kind of doomed from the start. Without the connection to Jerusalem and the temple, their own culture gradually eroded, and this can be seen in the many foreign influences that we saw tonight. From religion to art and architecture to leisure, they just basically wasted away. Jeroboam I knew and feared this. That's why he built those golden calves and altars at Dan and Bethel, was to try and hold on to some kind of legitimacy. But we know that ultimately it did not work. As we saw in our first class, there are many historical artifacts that demonstrate the historical reliability of the biblical record of ancient Israel. We talked about prophets tonight, and competing prophets played an active role in Israel. And though we don't actually have archaeological evidence for their existence, you'll notice I didn't have any artifacts on my prophet slides. They would have been a distinctive feature of Israelite society. It's pretty rare to have a culture that gave so much weight to the word and actions of prophets, and we can see how much they swayed politics through the biblical record. Israel, as we saw, built up substantial cities, especially during the Omride dynasty. So places like Samaria, Megiddo, and Jezreel were very strong fortified cities, and they're strong evidence for the biblical record and the fact that the Northern Kingdom was a kingdom. It wasn't just a bunch of loosely confederated villages and towns. It was a proper kingdom. And the Old Testament contains distinctive Hebrew forms of writing, and those are worth becoming familiar with and appreciating. They can help to deepen our understanding of how people appreciated scripture and writing in Old Testament times. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for your time and attention, and hopefully you found something interesting tonight.